Last week, Oil India made an important discovery. The state owned company announced that it had found a new supply of natural gas in the Andaman offshore region. This was, in fact, the second of three wells drilled in the block to confirm the presence of gas during the company's exploration of the Andaman Basin. And for a country like India, which is heavily dependent on imports for its energy needs, this news is strategically very significant. Hardeep Singh Puri, the Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas of India, even called the discovery an ocean of energy opportunities in a tweet celebrating the same. Now, commercial production is still several years, close to a decade away, with appraisals and studies taking place to assess the commercial viability of the reserve and if it can even be extracted economically. Still, like I mentioned earlier, this isn't the first discovery in the Andaman Basin, and multiple discoveries like this are hinting at the fact that this area might just become a new promising energy region for the country. As we all know very well by now, India's been having a tough time with its energy imports since the war on Iran escalated at the end of February this year and the Strait of Hormuz closed. Especially after the intensity of the LPG crisis that hit most Indian households in mid March, which my co host Snigdha covered in an episode back then, by the way, the truth was very difficult to ignore. That India is far too dependent on other countries for its fast increasing energy needs, and any disruption was always going to put it in a position like this. In a crisis, panicking and scrambling to find alternatives. But while the ongoing war has created a situation of scarcity for crude and natural gas right now, analysts are now discussing that it's also created the conditions for an excess of LNG and an eventual buyer's market. In an opinion piece for Bloomberg last week, Javier Blas, a commodities columnist, argued that what he called an LNG glut is inevitable. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, while it did trigger a short term scarcity, actually also accelerated what analysts are calling a significant price correction. Because now, on the demand side, all the consumers who had been dependent on the supply from the Gulf have been choked off and they have had to diversify to sources like solar and coal. Meanwhile, on the supply side, an increased investment in projects elsewhere has also increased the sourcing from outside of the Gulf. And while both might sound like good news for India, which is the discovery of domestic supply and cheaper import opportunities, both actually complicate each other in ways that could be less helpful than you'd think. Welcome to Daybreak, a business podcast from The Ken. I'm your host, Rachel Verghese, and every day of the week, my co-host Snigdha Sharma and I will bring you one news story that is worth understanding and worth your time. Today is Wednesday, the 10th of June. In the weeks following the conflict escalating, LNG prices in Asia more than doubled. From being about $10 per unit pre-crisis, the prices went up to about $25 by late March. Reports everywhere screamed shortage. Asia and Europe were both left hunting down alternatives. The report screaming shortage made sense because, you see, the US Energy Information Administration even reported that the closure of the strait affected approximately 20% of global LNG supplies. But right before the war, things were very, very different. A report from the IEA, or the International Energy Agency, that was updated just last month confirmed that last year, 2025, saw a record-breaking surge in FIDs, or final investment decisions. FIDs, by the way, is basically the point of no return, when a company commits to a project plan and assigns the capital for it. This is when the construction begins, contractors are hired, and everything is put into motion. The report said that the global gas market is on the verge of a new wave of LNG supply. The surge in FIDs has actually been something that's been going on since 2019, which was briefly interrupted in 2020 due to the pandemic. The new wave the report refers to is supposed to take place between 2025 to 2030. Blas argues that the Hormuz closure has delayed it by roughly a year, but has not cancelled it. A total of about 345 BCM or billion cubic meters of new LNG export capacity is supposed to come online from the projects that reached FID and were under construction at the start of 2025. This is reportedly the largest LNG capacity addition wave to date. You see, last year, global production was about 600 BCM. As Blas writes in his piece, there's also a pipeline of over 700 BCM of projects seeking FID, and he states that if everything in that pipeline actually does get built out, global LNG supply will more than double. And this wave that we've been talking about was only blocked by the closure of the strait, delayed. As Blas writes, this wave is not only still in the cards, though probably delayed about a year due to the closure of Hormuz, but it should be larger and likely longer lasting. He argues that if and when the strait opens and the supply from Qatar eventually comes back into the market, it's only going to make that wave stronger. He also hedges that any price correction at all is contingent on the peace talks between Washington and Tehran going strong and Hormuz reopening by July. The thing is, drops in prices have already been a feature of this period since the war began. When a US Iran ceasefire agreement was announced in early April, natural gas prices went down by almost 15% in Europe. Blas put it pretty well in his piece. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "It's a story as old as the commodity market. Today's high oil prices will sow the seeds of tomorrow's low ones. As prices for products increase, they create the conditions for a future fall. Producers rush to build more supply because at higher prices, projects that were previously too expensive to build suddenly look profitable. Meanwhile, consumers start looking for cheaper alternatives. Both are happening right now as we speak. So, what does this mean for India? Stay tuned. Qatar was providing nearly half of India's LNG imports in 2025. After it shut down natural gas production on March 2nd and the Strait of Hormuz closed almost simultaneously, Asia lost roughly 5.5 million to 6 million tons of LNG supply a month, which is the same as almost a quarter of the export flows from before the conflict. At the same time, like I mentioned earlier, the price per unit also more than doubled. But while countries like South Korea and Japan were cutting their imports, India had increased its own. In February, the imports were standing at 1.9 million tons. In March, that number fell to 1.67 million tons. But in May, that number again climbed up to 2.1 million tons, which is more than what it was in February. Now, how did this happen with Qatar not being a source anymore? Well, India found new suppliers in the US, Nigeria, and Oman. In fact, US exports to India have increased by nearly 6 times. India was initially buying roughly 100,000 tons of American LNG a month before the war. But by May, that number became nearly a million. But with the diversification comes the price stress. Analysts from ORF or the Observer Research Foundation reported this month that India's total LNG import value reached over $13 billion in the year 2025 to 2026. Increased prices in 2026 could push this up by 40 to 70%, which would certainly put additional pressure on India's current account and fiscal balances. So, a price reduction on the horizon sounds like a relief, right? It means cheaper imports, less pressure on that same current account. In the short term, it definitely would be. But in the long term, it also deepens India's dependency on imports. Because building out the infrastructure for deep water extractions like in the Andaman Basin is going to be expensive. And as I mentioned earlier, going to take a while. Pratik Pandey, head of APAC Oil and Gas Research at Rystad Energy, told Business Standard that the investment required to drill deep water wells is substantial. Each well is estimated to cost over $100 million. Success rates, though, are typically around a pretty low 20 to 30%. Add to that expensive uncertainty that India already has a history of continuing to rely on imports without sufficiently pulling its own weight. My colleague Anand covered this in a piece from a couple months ago, where he wrote about Reliance's failure to deliver on a promise to transform the country's energy landscape through its extraction projects. After an initial period of high output that eased India's dependency on outside sources, the company's output flagged, and India was forced into the same dependency again. At the same time, state owned ONGC and Oil India did not increase their output significantly to assist either. Now, while prices remain high, India still has the incentive to invest in domestic supply chains, even if momentarily expensive. But if the prices do reduce significantly, that drive goes away. And the incentive to import cheap gas starts to outweigh building expensive infrastructure. Considering that India also has a goal of increasing the share of natural gas in its energy mix from 6% to 15%, it seems unlikely that the country would wait for years to build out the necessary infrastructure if it can find faster and cheaper alternatives to get where it needs to. There's also the problem of having to answer to new masters entirely. The US isn't just any neutral supplier. It has already put India in tough positions using energy itself as a bargaining chip. In August 2025, Trump slapped a 25% tariff on Indian goods, on top of an existing 25%, by the way, for buying crude oil from Russia. He even threatened a tariff of 500% if India continued to buy Russian crude after the initial tariff hike. Even the deal that was declared in February this year, which eased the tariffs on India from the total 50% to 18%, was agreed to on the basis of India buying oil from America and Venezuela, which, by the way, is effectively managed by the US after the US removed Maduro from power earlier this year. And that means India is diversifying, well, mostly into the US's or a US adjacent supply. It's already slowly running out of room to maneuver in. So, if you add trade pressures to the obvious incentive that is cheap gas, and you can see how India can easily walk itself into a trap if it isn't careful. Commercial extraction of gas from the Andaman Basin is the better part of a decade away, which is roughly also how long Blas and other analysts estimate the glut period could last. So, if Hormuz reopens and the wave plays out as projected, and if timed right, India could be extracting from the ocean of opportunity as soon as the glut ends. But only if it decides to build out that energy independence fast.
Daybreak is produced from the newsroom of The Ken, India's first subscriber focused business news platform. What you're listening to is just a small sample of our subscriber only offerings. A full subscription offers daily long form feature stories, newsletters, and a whole bunch of premium podcasts. To subscribe, head to theken.com and click on the red subscribe button on the top of the Ken website. Today's episode was hosted and produced by my colleague Rachel Varghese and edited by Rajiv Sien.